Could you share a little bit about your role, kind of being an abbot, and the brief history of kind of getting there too?
Sure. Like brief history of
Kind of coming into practice and
okay.
priest and the mini year slog, I think. Not a slog, but you know.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I've been, early 20s. I kind of realized I didn't have like wisdom tradition to lean on, and I needed one. And I started looking, and Zen resonated, and I just checked out the temple one day, and Dharma Rain, and it wasn't during an event. It was just like I just kind of came by and pulled on the door, and it was open, and I went in and sat, and someone had just mistakenly left the door open, and
you just pulled up a cushion and sat?
Yeah, I sat for an hour. I thought, hey, this is great. It's always here for me to come sit whenever I want.
Yeah.
Hello, dog.
Hi, Nanda.
And so that was kind of my intro to.
Be careful with wires, Nanda.
Yes. And I started practicing. I did a 1 month kind of residency as sort of a trial thing, and as part of that, I realized that basically how I was living my life was to avoid suffering, and it was all indirect means of doing so, and it was all like I was in med school, and I was all this stuff that at some point, one more time removed, it would help me not suffer as much.
Oh, you were sort of on a track to get out of suffering.
Yeah, it just how I did everything through the day was appeasing my sense of potential future suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And Zen was doing something different. It was a more direct method, and I was like, well, if that's how it is, if that's actually how I'm living my life, why don't I dispense with the middleman here? And so I moved in and started training, and I just wanted to do whatever it took so that I could do this full time.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually that became a possibility, and I did it, and it's been 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And over that time, Dharma Rain's changed a lot. It's kind of evolved as an organization, and my teacher has retired, and so I've kind of taken her spot here. Kyogen, the other rabbit, died, and so there was a very gradual transition.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of 6 or 8 years, really, that it was happening. And so I feel really lucky that it was allowed to kind of be like that the timing has, it's just, there's so much has to happen for that to happen in a kind of peaceful and wholesome way.
That transition to kind of being abbot?
Yeah.
Can you speak a bit to the role of abbot, both maybe traditionally and maybe what it means today?
Generally, the most broad is the abbot is kind of the spiritual and administrative head of a temple, a training temple where people are undergoing formation. And so it's a mix. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff that are involved in it. There's the things that I would kind of saw in advance, or had more to do with the administrative side of things.
Mm-hmm. When you were leading into the role, sort of? Or?
When I was coming into it, yeah. And I think as I've landed, what is much more obvious is more the the kind of tone setting and the invisible part of being a figurehead, right? There's the obvious stuff, but then there's the more subtle stuff, and there's also the like being kind of constantly responsive to like the tensions of the community, like what's confusing right now, what's painful right now, what's aggravating right now. I just feel like I'm part of my role is to be quite attuned to that.
Yeah, sounds almost like a widening of sort of and holding that in your awareness.
Yeah.
And sort of maybe even seeing it as yourself, as something to, I don't mean self in a strong way, but like something to attend to.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, my sense kind of in the Dharmic world in the West, whatever that is, and is becoming like an abbot and even a priest too, or they don't make the transition as much. You know, there's like city centers, and it seems there's a lot of times like the teacher and then the sort of non-paid administrators that run it, and this sort of mix of like administrative head and spiritual head seems kind of unique these days. Even though I know there are, you know, a number of centers that are temples that do that.
There's so many different models in American Zen or in American Dharma in general. Like, it's just all over the place. So I you know, there's definitely places where there's kind of a really clear, you know, role for the abbot.
Yeah.
But, you know, like the vast majority of places, like it's kind of sitting group style, where there's someone who's been around a little bit longer, or there's a teacher, but they basically have a lay life that, and they're the head of the temple. So, you know, like Dharma Rain's been around for long enough, and there's been enough like kind of commitment from key people over time that there's enough momentum to kind of support like this functioning.
Yeah, you're not doing this alone.
Right.
Yeah, this isn't the thread I was necessarily thinking we would go, but I'm curious as we're talking, like how you hold sort of, as I relate to like priesthood and abbotness coming from Zen in Japan and maybe other sort of this transmission to the West of that there was such a hierarchical nature to it, and especially in decision making in a community and stuff, and it seems like there's been a movement over time to democratize a bit temple life. I don't know if that's something you resonate with, or
well, it's I do,
okay.
But I would say that again, that's really tremendous variation.
Yeah.
I think
I just wonder how you hold that sort of, if you hold that tension of sort of being the head of a temple, and also how to hold the community voice and community process.
Sure.
Maybe a more simplified way of holding the question.
Yeah. Well, you know, both resonate. I think both are necessary. I think it's a ongoing kind of exploration and investigation for like what's skillful right now, what's wholesome right now, what kind of speaks to the moment. And you know, I think like one thing I've noticed in the last 6 months is that, you know, as we've kind of been going through a series of crises,
as kind of COVID arises and other things are kind of unfolding.
Yeah, that a little bit more of a stronger voice and more has been needed.
Yeah.
In general, my kind of like root functioning, like my fallback, my what I'm most comfortable with is a more kind of concentric leadership model. I just kind of relying on kind of the horizontal authority, and you know, like it's rich here. I feel like there's a lot of people who've done a lot of practice.
There's a lot of people here that have been at it for a long time, right?
Right. And so I want to leverage that. Like I feel like you know, like that's one thing that I'm
you know, a hummingbird friend.
So. Oh, nice. Like I have a lot of appetite for like kind of leaning into like, you know, what I don't see. You know, like that's really interesting to me. I have a lot of aliveness there, and so that's something that I can't do alone. Like I can only like really like I do that from bouncing off of people, and so having others around who are like playing this with some subtlety like enables that.
seems like it requires some trust and honesty in the community that they'll sort of bring to you
It
the
helps.
things that are like
I don't know if it requires it, but it helps. Yeah.
I think of like more corporate structures, right, where
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of this challenge of don't challenge authority and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Have you felt any rub in the last 6 months and sort of taking on more of that vertical role, and like how has that been?
Oh, I mean, like there's always rub.
Yeah,
Like,
and then maybe more
there's always
personally for
friction.
yourself and
No,
no, it's been smooth. Yeah.
smoothish.
Yeah.
I mean, like, like that's not to say like there's not times when like I've been in knots or like I've broken down around stuff. Like of course, like that's part of it.
Yeah.
But it also feels like, oh yeah, that's appropriate right now. Like that's what should be happening.
Oh yeah. I really appreciate that sort of framing. Like when you say, no, it's been fine.
Yeah.
And then you're like, and there were knots and I was breaking down.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
that tension of holding those two. Yeah.
That seems realistic. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of when you were drawn to practice directly addressing suffering, and I'm wondering if you could hang out with that for a moment. Maybe both sides of that, the addressing and the suffering, and just sort of elaborate what that is for you, maybe in the evolution too of what it is for you now, not what it was for you when you were 20. Yeah.
Well, I would, maybe starting with suffering.
Yeah.
Like it's this very simple and very basic sense that we're apart. That there is a boundary, and whenever that's part of the picture, it hurts. You know, like, and from that, like, kind of basic miss, that basic, line drawing, like, there's repercussions.
Oh.
So
you feel like your hands did a lot there.
yeah. I mean, it just cascades. So that's my sense of suffering, like how I identify it in the wild.
And apartness, like that there's a separation.
Yeah.
Like, how do you see that manifesting sort of for yourself or folks that you work with? Like, what are the sort of expressions that apartness, like, and like that draw people to practice almost? Like, what kind of apartness is it? I think there takes many flavors. I don't know if that's true or not, or if you kind of hold it more on a basic level.
I'm using that because that feels very basic. It feels very fundamental.
Very direct almost.
Yeah. And that you can kind of trace every, there's a billion different manifestations of it, and everybody has their own like favorites of how, like, I like to suffer and how I know my own suffering and whatever. Like we've practiced and refined our suffering in very unique ways. And so, like, looking at a cross section of the Sangha, like, there's all these different languages of suffering that are out there, but I think they all trace back through that point of I'm different. I'm separate somehow. There's a gulf here. There's a gap here, and like, it doesn't have that doesn't have to be there. There's times when, like, we look at that gap and it's obviously erroneous. It's obviously like a phantasm. It's obviously like not. It's right. We see through it.
Yeah, and that seems like for a practice, like with working with that gap. Can you speak to what that is for you and how you see it maybe in Zen and kind of it's technical or non-technical?
Lots of reminders.
Lots of reminders, like in temple life, you mean? Or
well, that's one way. That's one strategy. Is like just kind of building in enough structure that, like, you keep running into things that remind you.
Yeah.
Whether that's formal structure like bells and a schedule, or informal structure, like if I'm washing my dishes and I'm going to be feeling my hands, like that, those kinds of like, simple things that happen.
The sort of intentionally building in practice
Yeah.
into the activities of daily life.
Right.
Yeah, I remember the first Zen retreat I went on when I was 20 or something. I'd done a couple other like Vipassana retreats, and I was just struck by like there's no getting out here.
Yeah.
Like it was like you step in the zendo with one foot a certain way. I didn't know that for a while. And like the way you turn on a cushion and how you hold your hands walking. There was like no looseness. It was like there's just always a chance to be like, oh, I'm not here right now.
Right.
Yeah. Do you see a sort of a journey or an arc of recognizing our sort of patterns of suffering and how we see them and work with that sort of, I forget the word, phantasm, or the sort of false gap that exists?
Well, I may not be understanding the question. I mean, the obvious arc is that we catch the coarse ones, and then as we get better at those and we start catching the medium, and then we start catching the subtle, like,
There's a refinement process.
Yeah. But I don't think that's quite what you're getting at. Can you, like...
Yeah, maybe I don't even know what I'm getting at. Let me take a moment. I guess this is just my own sense of sort of feeling really lost at first. Not in this like tremendous way, but like looking back while practicing. Like sort of being in the dark. And then over time starting like a light gets shined of like, oh, this is like these idiosyncratic expressions that feel like mine and maybe shared, but they're very much mine, of like, oh, this is where I generate suffering. Like this is my way of like diffusing, like in my own way of like sort of zoning out and checking out. And other people may have different ways, and like that's just start seeing it over time, and it sort of becomes clearer and clearer, and like that sort of journey of
that makes sense. I agree.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I'm about, I think on, what is today, Thursday? I'm 2 days I'm leaving on a self-constructed intensive. And it's like an attempt to sort of fuse surfing with a more intensive sort of practice period, about a month.
Right.
And I think you're in Ongo right now, is that correct?
Yeah.
Could you spend some time with maybe Ongo and like intensive practice and like what these sort of, is it 3 months here?
Yeah, 90 days.
Like
well, 3 months,
90 days.
September, October, November, through the end of Rohatsu.
Yeah.
So a little more than 90.
And then there's another one like later in the start of the new year, sort of.
So basically it's 3 months of fall, 3 months of spring.
Yeah.
We're in our intensive period, and then winter and summer are lighter.
And you've been living this for about 20 years or so?
Yeah, although the Ongo schedule, we didn't start doing it like this until about maybe 12 years ago.
Okay.
It was kind of gradual. Like in the beginning, like we didn't even have like Sunday program really in the summer every week. It was like the third Sunday would have a full program, and the other ones it would be much lighter, and there wouldn't be any weekday sitting. Like it was much lighter once upon a time.
Yeah, it's sort of filled as with time.
Right.
Yeah, because I even think about, I used to practice at a stripped down Zen center. It was like sort of forms were removed, but the teacher there added back in an intensive, like making it feel like sort of like, oh, this is important.
It is important. I think it's one of those things that, like a lot of meditative traditions use, because there's so much leverage that, concentration certainly, but also like kind of reflective intention, like it accumulates over time, and it has a half-life, right? So like it doesn't, like if you have a certain amount of concentration, like, and you don't keep it up, like a week from now it's not going to be as much.
Yeah, like after a retreat you feel it fade pretty quickly.
But if you kind of pile a retreat on top of retreat, like you can go someplace where you haven't gone before.
Yeah.
And it's not, it makes it sound very mathematical when it is not quite so simple.
And a bit materialistic, almost like getting somewhere.
But in a general way, like there's something to that.
Yeah.
And
just the kind of true, like the the actuality of kind of cumulative practice building on itself.
Yeah, and part of it is that like, in order to do that, you're not doing other stuff, which tends to diffuse practice energy.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really like a key part of like most angos is like, okay, so like how are you going to like keep the energy here?
Mm-hmm.
Like how are you going to devote it really, and not have it frittered, you know, in you know,
like
to
kind
habitual
of splinter off into habit energy, sort of.
Yeah. And it's creating a time which is sacred, you know, in which my intent is really for something deeper than, you know, whatever else. You know, like it's aiming deeper than
Yeah. What would you say are sort of some of the elements that build that up? Maybe even that sort of aren't necessarily Zen, but like the ingredients almost, if it's sort of a meal that's being made.
Time for silence.
Yeah.
I would say time for surprise. And so that could be like creativity, that could be art practice, that could be like working with a teacher, that could be, I mean, it could be a lot of different things, but something which like reflects aspects of you which you might not otherwise get. For some people, you know, meditation might be part of that. I think meditation is another leg in and of itself, like just having that. I think a kind of simplicity of lifestyle, like that's really significant for me when I've done retreats, is like I want to pare away as much as I can. Like the retreats that have been most significant for me have been ones in which I've really like brushed aside like as much as possible of like everyday life, and really like given myself to this process.
I don't think you're saying this, but I hear in there like almost a bit of a dualism around sort of everyday life and these practice periods. And like, I think you know, I mean, that's like a tension I have in my own history and self. Throw me in a retreat context, I feel fairly comfortable. Throw me in like a mall or like at certain meetings, I'm like, oh man, this is not safe.
Sure.
So like, how do you hold that sort of, that this is about everyday life, right? It's about how we show up as people, but then there's this sort of paring down.
Well, like when it's time for the meetings, like do the meetings and be wholehearted and thorough about it, and you know, like, but part of being able to offer that graciously is that like some of the other stuff that's more subtle is I know I have confidence that that's being taken care of, right? Like I'm doing that work, and so now that it's not retreat, I can play with Excel spreadsheets, you know, or whatever it is I need to do that feels very kind of mundane at times.
Yeah, what I heard in there a bit was like that subtle, which maybe is hard to put more words to, but like it's hard in everyday life. It's hard to attend to that and give it the energy or relationship, and that these pared down periods kind of allow us to connect to that subtle dimension a bit. I see the squinty eyes.
Yeah, I like.
Would you reframe that, or how you would hold that differently?
Yeah. Like of course, like there's like many people, almost everybody who's done sesshin early on is like, wow, this is so different, right? Like this is so different from what I'm normally doing, and like, you know, like, and that really feels right, you know. Lots of gratitude, and so, right, yes, of course, but that's not like, it's not all the way true, and as people do a lot of sesshin, as they do a lot of retreat practice, a lot of ango periods or whatever it may be, that distinction between the two gets finer. Like it's not as obvious, you know,
Mm.
because it's the boundary is more permeable, and we're more practiced in bringing that kind of liveness, richness, vulnerability, authenticity, whatever it is, into mundane, crappy stuff. Right?
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, as I hear it, it's sort of opening a door that allows it in
Yeah.
the other side, like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
kind of into everyday. Maybe that distinction even fades a bit, sort of.
Yes, I think so. I think it does, and yeah. But I think the original point that I was
Yeah, please.
going for was that like there's so much energy that goes into like the it's not even like the like logistical stuff. It's just like the habitual like kind of like momentum of life,
Mm-hmm.
and so much of that is optional, and like it's threatening to like release that, you know, to do something different, and it brings up a lot of kind of like animal stuff and like kind of reptilian stuff for folks often, and on a retreat, like if you have that much support, it's pretty easy to like feel that, be with that, and not be dissuaded.
To
and
work with that threatening period, sort of.
yeah. And that frees up a lot of energy for meditation, you know, for kind of delving in.
Oh, sort of as you work through those knots, that opens.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
like
like
it's like the it feels like that's more of a freeing than a working through of knots.
a freeing.
Yeah, like it's just like I'm just not putting energy into that,
Oh.
and so therefore it's available, and I don't have to use it. I'm not like trying to untie things. I'm just like, it's the availability which counts.
Yeah.
You know, like in Zazen, you're not really doing something. You're just available. And
that's my favorite definition of Zazen I've heard yet. I've been looking for a good one for a long time.
There you go. You've got it on tape.
Thank you.
It'll probably be different next week.
That's fine. I'll keep that one. Yeah, I think I forget who was the Roshi and what's that island in Washington? Do you know what I'm talking about? That guy?
Harada Roshi?
Yeah, Harada Roshi.
Yeah.
Someone read something he said once when I was on retreat that it's like a deer in a forest, kind of looking at the forest, and there's not a predator there yet, but there's like an attentiveness.
Oh, that's funny. I've heard Chosen use that analogy. You must be quoting him. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
like there's a circular. Yeah. That was where I heard it attributed to.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
But the way you said it, it's hard to describe that deer scenario.
Yeah.
Available,
Right,
very
right.
succinct. You know, on a personal level, one thing I'm curious about, kind of stepping into this in a couple days, I'm feeling like ill-prepared. You know, like, ugh, what am I getting myself into?
Yeah. Yeah.
Holding this sort of, for me,
certain dread.
yeah, that which has always been there for me on
Right.
going into intensive or even a psychedelic or certain things that really are gonna shake things up a bit, maybe. Or
Yeah.
sometimes it doesn't shake up as much as I anticipate, but there's always a sort of a charge to it. That I've been holding this sort of, because one thing I'm doing is like going into the world a bit. Like I'm in a van.
Right.
Like a cop can knock on my door. There's people around. It's not as cloistered or as sort of contained, and this sort of like the intention I bring, like my intentions, like that I'm wanting to hold during that time, but also the intention that the intensive or the retreat period wants also. Like I've felt that in the past, like almost certain callings happen, like, oh, you're like personifying a bit, right? But like, oh, this is what's wanting to be attended to, or this is what's emerging. And I'm wondering, like, if that resonates, like holding that sort of kind of maintaining the intention and going with the emerging sort of expression that's happening.
I think, like, another of these like ingredients for an ango is vow.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of what you're getting at. Is
Yeah.
that, like, we set an intention and we don't really, like, we have some guesses. We have some, like, there's some kernel in there about, like, oh, this is really important. This really matters right now. And we might think a little higher up in our awareness that, like, oh yeah, this has some good leverage and it really makes sense, or maybe it's poetic, or like, there's stuff that happens. And however that happens, like, we kind of like coalesce around something, and it's a moving target, and our conditions keep changing, and our intention kind of has an ebb and flow to it. And so it's you're trying to like keep feeling the pulse of that moving target as it goes through this month for you.
Yeah.
And if it's if you're holding too tight to it, then you lose the like responsiveness that you need to, like, kind of keep it live. And if you hold too loose to it, then you kind of forget, like, what am I here for, or, like, you lose some of the intensity, right? So it's the two sides of the road. You don't drive off either one. Stay. Keep veering back towards the middle.
Yeah. One of my, like, curiosities, like, on a kind of transformational level, is someone that's been interested in that for a while in different domains.
The camera shut off.
Oh no.
Or the light did, at least.
Oh no, I think Ananda moved it quite a bit.
Oh.
Here, let's hope that gets you good. This one we can use,
Yeah.
Let me reconnect.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you for that heads up. That was appreciated. I now know how long they last. I'm curious about, like, the attribution of a transformational space, like an ango, a retreat, like a wilderness thing, or and I believe there's some power there, that, like, when we do that, that actually coalesces it,
Right.
and we sort of
Invoke it
choose it in certain domains.
Yeah.
And that something around, like, trusting that when we intend that and, like, put ourselves and with commitment and energy, that it my hands are trying to communicate, but, like, something churns or mulches or gestates, or, like, there's something that happens when we give something in our life that power to support us in this sort of endeavor.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think people have expressed that in many different ways over time, and it's felt differently to me at different times. There are times when there's a real sense of, like, like presence, or, like, like I'm doing this, and like it's supported by, like, like all beings. Like there's a sense of, like, bodhisattvas are, like, involved with this, right? And,
yeah. Thanks for saying that, Zen teacher. You don't get that enough in Zen, in my view.
Yeah. I mean, like, and it's not like I don't necessarily, like, personify it particularly, but just that sense of, like, benevolence, right? Like in a root way, like this kind of basic benevolence and responsiveness, and like my effort is witnessed, and it's not just like, and so part of that, like, I feel that as an accountability thing. Like, if I'm, like, it's one thing to, like, sit still and impress people in the Zendo, but like if like, but I'm the only one who's, like, aware of
the internal,
like, how available I am. But I feel like when I set that kind of ongoing intention, like, I'm not the only one, right? Like the resonance is happening in other ways, which I can't talk about particularly.
And
Right.
I imagine you sort of feel the reverberation or some of that benevolence through the intention.
Yeah, and like sometimes that feels confident, and sometimes it feels like dreamy or squishy or whatever. And
yeah.
I mean, I've never really felt much compunction to explain or define that. It just feels like, okay, well, that's how it is right now.
Yeah. You use the word transformational or transformation a bit, like maybe more than I've heard from some Zen folks.
Okay.
This is just my own
Yeah,
like data
sure.
point of like
Okay.
the 5 people that I
Yeah,
draw
yeah.
to in Zen. You know,
Sure.
like sort of transformational space. I'm just curious if you could put some words to what that is for you, transformation and even space. When I was younger, I did a research project at the Institute of Noetic Sciences where we studied transformation and interviewed all these people and codified it. And my like little section was community that I had to codify. So like, I tinker with this stuff a bit in my mind and just you say that and I assume like we're sharing the same language or something, and I'm like, wait, what do you actually mean when you say that?
We're engulfed in mint right now. She's harvesting the mint there.
Yeah, I was with the lavender a moment ago too.
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to talk about that. I mean, like in the one, like there's the self which smells mint and lavender, and the self which didn't, and like, like there's just those, like, that it's kind of trivial, but actually it's not. Like, just that constant refreshing, that constant newness of life, that like, we tend to gloss over that, like how different one moment of experience is from the next, and like imagine this continuity, and like, it's such a big mistake. Like there's so much like lost there, and so much like sharpness and richness of like vividness. So that's one aspect. I think the aspect that I was talking about before has to do with like a willingness, like an invitation to be someone different. And we have, it's very similar, like, to the mint. Like there's a sense who I think I am, and it may not be what's needed right now. And so if I'm stuck with that, if I'm holding on in lots of ways, I don't have anything to offer.
Thinking of someone I was with yesterday in a psychotherapeutic context that through the work was like, I don't know who I'd be if I wasn't disappointed in myself. Like seeing the disappointment and like I felt this sort of like, what happens if I don't know if I can put this down.
Yeah, right. As painful as it is, and so that's a transformative space. Like that, like the person got to a point of like, oh, there's a pivot, and I could either pivot or I could not pivot. Like that's what it's about.
Yeah.
And most people have to see that a lot. And it's before they can do it, and they have to go through that process in many facets of life. Like just because you can do it around red lights doesn't mean you can do it around like your boss or your mom or whatever.
Or the homeless person down the street. I feel really drawn to asking you about ancestors. If I could, like, why that I think that's emerging as we're together is part of this project that I'm doing is around my dad and our relationship, which he left me when I was 5, came back later in life, and I've tried to make we've tried to work it out as best we can, you know,
For some of it.
with that history, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was a surfer, like a pretty prominent surfer in the 70s, like before pro surfers were really a thing, but he was like kind of on that vanguard.
Yeah.
And it's like who he is on some level. But he stopped when he was like 23, 24 and kind of went down a different path with drugs and partially why he wasn't in my life.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had this interesting thing happen with my grandpas that I learned later that they both wanted to be psychologists. You know? And
both
then like
grandpas on either
yeah,
side.
after I was sort of like in that trajectory in life in college and stuff. And I was just like, oh, that was interesting. And then this sense with my dad too that like something in me needs to surf. I don't really get it. And it was like later in life it sort of turned on. Like it was always been there a bit with me when I was younger, but a few years ago it was just like, this is the only thing I really, one of the few things that seems worth it to me in life.
Yeah.
That I don't have to try to do. Like I wake up early for.
Yeah.
You know, I don't wake up early to come to the temple anymore, but I wake up early to go surf. And this sense of sort of like an ancestral heritage there, that there's something that's continued. And I think that's like a real part of Zen in a way, and I think of Dogen in that, and sort of maintaining the activity of Buddha ancestors. And I'm just curious for you what sort of ancestors are in your sense, and kind of wherever that goes for you, not that you can give a definitive kind of statement right now.
Well, yeah, I mean it's a really rich topic in general, and for me.
Hello.
It's a hummingbird again.
A chill, hanging out. That's a rarity.
Yeah. The two most obvious ways that I experience lineage has to do, or ancestry, I think.
Lineage is fine.
Yeah. Has to do with, like, you know, contemplative practice and like that was really one of my gateways in. That really like kind of galvanized me with this, is feeling in a very, very like visceral animal way, like a sense of responsibility to the effort that has gone into this over time. You know, to the effort that people have put into, like, not like, you know, continuing the Zen tradition, but also like in a more broad sense, like just like dealing with their stuff, you know, like really seeing deeply. And it's so difficult and precarious and threatening, you know, like it takes a lot. It demands a lot of commitment, a lot of dedication, a lot of sacrifice to put that amount of that much at stake. And because people have done that through time, like, you know, we get to do it now. And so, like, I'm delighted to have that like responsibility, like to like, you know, feel that like imperative to continue that. So that's one aspect, and the other aspect has to do with like you know, it's this really, like it's the you know, this treasure trove of the natural world, and being an insignificant part of it, and being like in every aspect held by that, and like what I get to offer is basically appreciation. You know, it's like I do what I can, you know, but basically it's appreciation. and
a sort of tangible, like, I mean, you touch when you name appreciation.
well, yeah, like, offering, that caring, that mindfulness, that,
Yeah.
Like I pull weeds, like I
Yeah.
do stuff, but it's that's an expression of that kind of basic sense of gratitude
Yeah.
and like reverence.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a period in my life when I was doing hospice for one of my dogs that passed.
Yeah, right.
And he declined really quickly due to kind of like what was going on physically for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like 2 weeks before like a lively, spirited animal, and then was
really
like
quick.
old
Yeah.
in 2 weeks, and he was walking around Laurelhurst, the pond there. It's like a beautiful pond in the city center, and I just hung out there for like 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just looking at him look,
Yeah.
like taking in the world, you
Yeah.
know, and like what a gift that was to see that those, like knowing he was going to die in like 2 days, and he was like smelling, and that just kind of came up as you were talking about the appreciation, this sort of this tangibleness of life.
It makes sense because it's like that episode example that you bring up is like it's really emphasizing the ephemeralness of it, like it's fleeting, it's like it keeps changing, and so like
and
that,
it's beautiful.
that makes it more precious.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think we were talking a little while ago. I don't remember when this was months ago. And like someone had asked you to go on a radio show to give like a little plug around, and you're like, I'm not going to talk about emptiness for 20 seconds.
Oh yeah, right. I have a vague sense of that.
Yeah, so you don't need to know.
Yeah.
Can you talk about emptiness a bit?
Yeah.
And I'll give a little more context, a little more priming.
Okay.
Part of this kind of this retreat or this intensive, and it's like connected to my dad and surfing. I got the same surfboard that he had, not exactly, but what he rode when he was 25, and I'm going to take it to the spots that he rode that I actually haven't surfed before, even though really close. You just become very like niche when you surf. Like I go to this one spot only.
Right.
Like my dad surfed 40 yards up from there. Not quite, it's like a mile and a half, but you know what I mean? I've never been there once, even though I know of it. So I have
it's
his
probably
boat.
really different. I mean, 30 years of shifting sand. Like
I'm excited to talk to him about like after I surf his spot, describing it and hearing his description in that. Because waves change and culture changes, and even surfing with the boards they ride. I'm going to be riding a board that's weird for right now.
Yeah, right.
Especially in Southern California. And my dad was really into barrel riding. Like drop it. It's like you kind of drop into the wave and it curls over you. And there's this sort of pause moment where you want to slow into it, but you have to get out too.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like the apex for surfing in a lot of ways.
Right.
I don't get out very often. I can get in. So like one of the, maybe even just the narrative framings of the trip is like getting out of the barrel. And so many surfers describe that experience in very like spiritual language that resonates with me outside of being in a barrel, like in practice or like in certain experiences of, like they describe the sound enveloping them and just kind of almost maybe being in God's presence or the vortex or emptiness. You can feel them grasping for words, to contain that experience. And then I've heard Zen folks and all the other folks that are engaged in sort of this thing of awareness. I'm wondering if you can speak in your own way to that thing that's hard to talk about.
I think the reason it's hard to talk about is that it's so prominent, right? It's so.
That was a surprise. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think like barrel riding, I've never done it.
Yeah.
Right, but that sounds like that's fairly unusual. Like it's an extreme experience, right? That like you have to set up conditions in a particular sort of way in order for that to happen.
You have to be able to do it. The wave has to do it. There's a lot going into it.
Right, and years of preparation, whatever. So, and so like the specialness is obvious, right? And when people have direct experience of like just how special this is, like it's hard to like this is a broken piece of concrete that is just sitting here like
a cinder block.
Yeah, like it's so like whatever, like there's nothing obviously sacred about that, but it can be, right? And like like there's cinder block consciousness, like there's like like that can speak the Dharma. And so we don't look for like it's empty just like this. Yeah. Like people don't say that. They refer to like right? Peak experiences of like skiing or surfing or music or making art or meditation retreat or conversation with a teacher or whatever it may be. Like the kind of like peak experiences sort of life. Yeah. Right. But I think part of what happens as you accumulate some of those peak experiences is that like it shines through, right? Like you may need something like that intense to like recognize it, but as you get comfortable recognizing it, like it's actually much more prominent. And we have such a like it's that boundary that I was talking about, like that habit of like putting Buddhahood on the other side of that boundary is so prominent, is so like immediate. It's a protective response, basically. I think like we are not required as much if Buddha's out there and not here. Yeah. We don't have to be aware of as much. We don't have to like attune as much. Like there's just the stakes are lower, and it's inaccurate. Yeah. So.
Hang out there. Hang out there. It's inaccurate.
It's inaccurate to say that we're not Buddha.
Yeah.
And.
Why are we not? What? See, like we're all Buddha.
Well, that's my sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really trust that.
Yeah.
That's not to say that I'm always in touch with it or I always remember it. For sure, there's a range of access. But there's a deep way in which I trust it.
I was hanging out in a forest the other day, and pretty special to me. It's like one of my places I attribute value and sacredness. But I was with friends hanging out, which I usually am like alone in the forest. And it was hard to connect to the forest, so I was like hanging out with my friends. And I was thinking about like sacred tree groves, like those things that exist and used to exist. Right. And I'm like, we had to make a grove sacred because it's too much for it all to be sacred. Like, this one's sacred, and maybe there's more to the why that one's sacred, but like it gets overwhelming if it's all worth like devotional reverence and like a cinder block of
right.
Like, I don't know if anything comes up for you.
How frequently do we allow ourselves to be disrupted? Yeah. And like, a moment of reverence is really disruptive. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I don't even know how the sound's being picked up right now. I looked up like that's a bit low, but who knows?
Yeah. I mean, it's very disruptive, and like it's disruptive of our narrative, of our sense of like, oh, this is the continuity of like who I am and how I do and what I expect. And when we're like struck by the magnificence, the luminousness of a moment, like it interrupts that. Like that narrative can't just flow, like it diverts. And like so like one of my like aspirations is to like be interrupted easily, right? Like to be like be surprised with grace. Like we share our intention for the day at breakfast, and my intention for today was to pivot easily. So it's another way of getting at that.
Yeah.
That I want to be disrupted, you know.
Yeah, and maybe we'll kind of this be the last.
Okay.
And this one's more personal, you know, taking advantage of.
Shoot, disrupt me.
How do I hold it? Kind of a recent arc, but longer arc. You know, maybe it's been 9 months or so, or 6 months. I can't say, but it feels like a long season of really being oriented or interested in like being with the flow, going with it, and whatever the flow is, like trusting as that sort of benevolence. Like, you know, sometimes I'm like, oh, is this the right thing to be doing? Or like, what do I do here? There's so many choices to make every day. And like, not every one of them feels like I'm making a good choice.
Second guessing of flow.
Yeah, it's like it's all flow, baby. But like, oh, can I, like, do I do this or that? Like, wait, was that a good idea? And kind of trying to relax that a bit and just move with, you know, and work in progress, totally. And that like had a certain quality to it for a while. And then recently, like something's returned, it feels like, or the dials are changing a bit of like discipline and structure. And like those two, like being willing to pivot, but then you like the way I see from the outside, like it's a very regimented sort of life in some ways, like time and structure and like that's really hard for me to hold that together, you know, like those two energies sort of, or especially like without a bell that's someone else is ringing.
Yeah.
And if you could kind of, I don't know if that brings up for you.
Yeah.
I think I'm nervous about that for the trip. Like how much schedule, how much pivoting, how much, like in that sort of staying in the lane and honoring the intentionality, whatever that might be.
Well, I think part of the reason, like the bell, like it, on the one hand, like it's structure, right? It's like, oh, now it's time to do this, but but I'm getting at like the intrapersonal leverage, right? So like in that moment of the bell ringing, like my activity just got disrupted. I was in the middle of doing something, and now I need to do something else. Okay. And so like yes, it's structure, and that's a particular kind of but it's also this like invocation of like ephemeralness.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I was appreciative of that. That's sort of that pivoting coming from maybe like an organized sort of rhythm or structure, but then also from all the other ways that it happens. Like, I mean,
it's always me bouncing off of it. Like that's my experience again and again. So that's where you know.
Yeah, I'm like just thinking because I'm driving down and like I'll be periods alone, and then periods with people, and then like coming in and out of that. Like one of those will be with my like 20-year-old sister that really loves going to the bars, and I can go to a bar.
Right.
But like going to a bar on an intensive, like, what is that?
Sure.
So,
you know, I think like you're gonna have to like some of your touchstones are gonna be things more like curiosity than like silence.
Yeah.
Right. That you can always use that. You can always like, that's always an anchor for you during this period. It's like, well, what do I learn here?
Yeah.
You know, what does this show me about myself, or what is this?
Yeah.
You know.
Cool. Thank you so much for hanging out, man. I really appreciate this.
Sure.